Hi everyone, thanks for listening to the Scandinavian History Podcast with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, the hats and caps continue to fight each other in the Swedish Riksdag. I admit that so far the picture I've painted of the Age of Liberty hasn't exactly been rosy, but there were a few positive aspects of this period as well. Today, we'll focus on one of those aspects, something that we still derive benefit from to this day. I refer to the encouragements of science and industry that led to some pretty consequential leaps forward for mankind. Episode 113, Science and Industry. In previous generations, scholars had adhered to the ancient Greek way of exploring the world. Aristotle had been particularly influential on European scholarship for hundreds of years. That basically meant that you sat at home by your desk and made stuff up, and then wrote elaborate explanations to justify it. Okay, I exaggerate slightly, but only slightly. The 18th century saw the dawn of what we call the Enlightenment. This was a new way of looking at knowledge. Enlightenment scholars weren't satisfied with believing a theory just because it was ancient. No, they wanted to test a theory before they believed it. And when they started to test all these traditional theories about how the world worked, they started to realize that it was mostly nonsense. The Age of Liberty coincided with the growth of Enlightenment thinking in Scandinavia, and this new way of looking at things was encouraged by politicians who hoped to make money on scientific advancements. Another factor that enabled a new generation of scientists to work was the decreasing power of the church, whose eternal truths previously had worked as a wet blanket, effectively extinguishing sparks of independent thinking. This point shouldn't be exaggerated, though. The church was still very powerful, which we'll see in future episodes. But during the Enlightenment, it was on the defensive. The Age of Liberty saw the emergence of several important scholars in the field of history, literature, and economics. But today, we'll focus on science and scientists. This episode will focus on three important Swedes that lived and worked during the Age of Liberty: Carl Linnaeus, Anders Celsius, and Jonas Alströmer. Let's start with Carl Linnaeus. Actually, his name was Carl Nilsson because his father's name was Nils, and back in the 18th century, regular people didn't have last names. They only used a so-called patronym, meaning that they were designated as their father's son or daughter. That was usually enough for day-to-day life in Scandinavia back then. By the way, in Iceland, this is still the norm. On that island, only about 20% of the population have a last name, and approximately 15% of those are of foreign origin. Anyway, the only 18th century Scandinavians who had a proper last name were aristocrats, whose family names weren't last names strictly speaking, and people who'd studied at university. University students often took a last name to indicate that they were better, or at least more educated, than the unwashed masses. We've already come across this tradition when we talked about the various Lutheran reformers who changed their names from Pettersson to Petri and from Andersson to Andrei. Since you couldn't become a priest without studying for a few years at university, many priests had last names, usually Latinized ones. Linnaeus is one such name. Carl's father, Nils Ingmarsson, took the name Linnaeus when he studied theology. The name isn't actually Latin though, but a fake Latin version of the Swedish word for a linden tree, because he particularly liked a tree of this kind that stood on the farm where he grew up. But I digress. Carl Linnaeus was possibly the best-known scientist of his generation, not only in Sweden, but in the entire world. He enjoyed international fame already in his lifetime, and he changed the way we think about flowers to this very day. Okay, he changed the way biologists think about flowers to this very day, but that's still something. And not only flowers, actually. Linnaeus' claim to fame is that he set up a system we still use today for categorizing flowers, animals, and everything else that's alive on the planet. But let's start from the beginning. Carl Linnaeus was a descendant of priests on both his father's and mother's side. His father was a priest, and so was his maternal grandfather. But not all his ancestors had been on good terms with the church. His great-great-grandmother, Johanne Pedersen, had been burned at the stake in Stavanger in Norway for being a witch. Linnaeus' father, Niels, wasn't just a priest, he was an amateur botanist as well, and his garden was apparently one of the most splendid ones in the province. Already at a young age, Karl also displayed an interest in plants, especially flowers. His father, the botanist priest, was happy to encourage his interest and gave him a small plot of land of his own where he could grow his own plants and flowers. Niels didn't only introduce his son to the world of botany, he also taught him about religion, geography, and basic Latin, as one does. When Karl was 7 years old, he had apparently learned all the botany, theology, geography, and Latin his father had to teach him, so he was sent to school. The plan was that he'd become a priest just like his father and grandfather before him, but his teachers informed his father that young Karl wasn't cut out for the priesthood, at least not for the study to become a priest. As a consolation prize, they suggested that he become a doctor instead. His father accepted this bitter fate, and Carl Linnaeus was sent off to study medicine privately. A few years later, in 1727, the same year that Sweden joined the Hanoverian Alliance, he moved to Lund to continue his studies at the university. During his downtime there, he used to make excursions in the Scanian countryside to explore its flora together with other students who shared his interest in plants. I can't imagine why, but after only 1 year, Linnaeus decided to switch universities and move to Uppsala instead. Even though he was supposed to study medicine, he spent a lot of his time in the university garden, where he met a professor of theology, who also happened to be into botany. The professor was so impressed with Linnaeus' knowledge of flowers that he offered him to live for free at his place, where the young student would also have access to the professor's private botany library, which at the time was the most extensive one in Sweden. I know what you're all thinking, but there was actually nothing fishy about that offer, and Linnaeus profited greatly from free housing, free food, and access to this impressive library. For instance, in 1729, he wrote a groundbreaking essay about the sex life of plants called Praeludia Sponsaliorum Plantarum, and the following year he was headhunted to lecture at the university, even though he was only a second-year student there. Nonetheless, his lectures were mighty popular and soon drew crowds of up to 300 people. That would be a lot today, but at the time it must have been sensational if you take into account that there were only about 900 students at the university in those days. It was about now that Carl Linnaeus decided to create a brand new system to classify plants. He decided to base his system on the stamens and pistils, which are the bits in the middle of the flower that plants use to reproduce. He even started to write a book about it, but in December 1731 he suddenly had to move out of his cushy and free lodgings at the theology professor's house following some unspecified controversy with the professor's wife. Far be it from me to speculate that he'd gotten himself into some kind of Potiphar's wife situation, so I definitely won't suggest that. But he did have to spend that Christmas back at home with his parents for the first time in 3 years. His mother was still not over the fact that he wasn't studying to become a priest, but she was at least marginally consoled by the fact that he was teaching at the university. In 1735, Carl Linnaeus went to the Netherlands to get a doctorate in medicine. It was popular among Swedish students, not least since you could just turn up, hand in something you'd written, and get a diploma within a few weeks. That's exactly what Linnaeus did, but even though he became an instant MD, he stayed on in the Netherlands for another 3 years. Back home in Sweden in 1739, he founded the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, together with 5 other scientists. Nowadays, the Academy is perhaps best known for deciding who gets the Nobel Prize in chemistry and physics every year. For the rest of his life, Linnaeus worked as a professor of medicine and botany at Uppsala University. But that doesn't mean that he spent the rest of his days in Uppsala. In fact, during an age when people rarely traveled much, Linnaeus got around quite a lot. He went on several expeditions throughout Sweden to collect and classify flora and fauna. One of his first, and perhaps best known expeditions, went to Lapland. As we've already covered in the episode about the Sami, that wasn't a part of the country that was particularly well known to people living in the south, and Linnaeus hoped to discover new plants and animals, and perhaps even valuable minerals and metals. In addition to the wildlife, Linnaeus also wanted to explore and document the traditional way of life of the Sami people who lived there. he traveled on horseback and on foot through partly roadless terrain, carrying with him everything you might need on an expedition in the wilderness, as well as his journal, various botanical and ornithological books, and paper for pressing flowers. He traveled north up the coast from Uppsala at a leisurely pace, getting off the horse from time to time to check out some flower, plant, or rock that he thought looked interesting. Close to Gävle, a town some 100 kilometers north of Uppsala, he found a large number of a flower that he really liked. Today, it's known as Linnea borealis, named after Carl Linnaeus. After 6 months, he returned to Uppsala in October. By then, he had traveled some 2,000 kilometers, which is more or less the distance from Los Angeles, California to Dallas, Texas. During his voyage, Linnaeus had observed a large number of plants, rocks, birds, and other animals. Based on my own experience from Lapland, I assume many of those animals were mosquitoes. Even though Lapland isn't exactly known for its rich flora and fauna, Linnaeus was still able to find and document approximately 100 species that were previously unknown, at least by people living outside of Lapland. Upon his return, he sat down and wrote a book about his voyage, called Flora Laponica. In it, he described 534 species and classified them using his newly developed system. A separate book, describing the voyage as a whole, including descriptions of the Sami, was published only after his death. A few years later, the governor of Dalarna, not the one who was almost lynched in the last episode, but his predecessor, invited Carl Linnaeus to tour his province as well. The governor had heard about the expedition to Lapland and was keen on a similar survey of Dalarna. Linnaeus was more than happy to accept the invitation. This time, he brought along 7 of his students who had shown particular aptitude in their studies. They went to the town of Falun, and from there they went north on a blitz expedition that ended back in Falun on August 17th. They visited over a dozen parishes and even crossed into Norway at one point in order to gather information about the mining industry there. Also, this voyage resulted in a book with a Latin title that described the flora and fauna, as well as the lives and traditions of the locals. Linnaeus actually returned to Falun that winter to spend the Christmas holidays at a friend's house. During this winter visit, he met a young woman called Sarah Elizabeth, and the two fell in love. But Linnaeus was distraught by this turn of events, since he was poor, relatively, whereas Sarah Elizabeth came from a very wealthy family. So he decided not to humiliate himself by proposing to her, until he realized that her father was a big fan of his, and he didn't mind his daughter marrying the brilliant Linnaeus, even though he wasn't loaded. Even though the books describing his voyages were popular, Linnaeus is famous for one particular book, namely the so-called Systema Naturae. Even though he'd already developed his classification system before he left for the Netherlands, it was there he found the money to print the book. The Systema Naturae was published in the Netherlands in 1735, introducing the world to the sex life of plants. According to Linnaeus' system, you can divide any living thing into the categories classes, orders, genders, and species, and newly discovered plants were named according to this classification system, giving you instant information about a plant just through its name. The book didn't cover plants alone, but also animals, even humans. As far as I know, Linnaeus was the first scientist to group human beings with other animals, based on his classification system. During his long career, Carl Linnaeus attracted large numbers of admirers in the academic world. A group of about 20 of these are called his disciples, and some of those are even known as apostles, due to their efforts to spread the word about Linnaeus' work and discoveries. Several of these set out on expeditions around the world to discover and classify hitherto unknown plants and animals according to Linnaeus' classification system. These voyages were quite eventful and sometimes downright dangerous. A few disciples died on these expeditions, so maybe Linnaeus had been prudent to limit his voyage to Sweden itself. As annoying as the mosquitoes of Lapland may be, they don't pose any mortal danger. The so-called first disciple was a guy called Christopher Ternström. He was a botanist, of course, but he was also a priest, and Linnaeus arranged for him to get a job as the priest on a ship belonging to the Swedish East India Company. In February 1746, Ternström set sail for China. Despite being hired to be a priest, his primary concern wasn't the spiritual well-being of the people on board. He brought along a list of 14 requests from Linnaeus among them goldfish that he was supposed to give as a gift to Queen Louisa Ulrika, and a tea bush for Linnaeus himself. Unfortunately, Ternström didn't bring home anything, neither goldfish nor tea bushes, because he caught a fever in December and died on an island off the coast of Vietnam. Another of Linnaeus' disciples, who was also both a botanist and a priest, was called Olof Thorén. He also got a job as a ship priest on one of the ships belonging to the Swedish East India Company, and it took him all the way to China in the end of the 1740s. He managed to survive the voyage, and even went back to China on a second journey a few years later. His letters to Linnaeus have been published, and they contain a lot of useful information about Southeast Asian plants and animals. During the second journey, Thorén fell ill, and even though he made it all the way back to Sweden again, he died soon after his return home in 1753. A third disciple was called Per Kalm. He too had the well-known combo degree of theology and botany, but he was also interested in economics and eventually ended up as professor of that subject at the University of Turku, the capital of Swedish Finland. During his studies at Uppsala, Kalm soon became an admirer of Linnaeus, and the admiration was mutual. Kalm, who became one of Linnaeus's favorites, was sent to North America, and when he arrived in Philadelphia in September 1748, he met and befriended another famous man, namely Benjamin Franklin. The primary goal of the voyage to America was to gather information about useful, preferably edible, plants that could be imported to Sweden. Kalm was particularly interested in a kind of wild rice that he hoped would thrive in Finnish swamps. If that would work out, hunger would be a thing of the past in Finland. Kalm spent the winter of 1749 in Swedesboro, in the former colony of New Sweden on the Delaware River. There, he met a widow called Anna Margareta Sjöman, who he married on New Year's Day 1750, which for some reason really upset Linnaeus when he heard about it. That's extra funny, considering how Linnaeus himself met his wife. Anyway, Linnaeus had time to calm down because Kalm stayed in America for a couple of years. He visited both the Blue Mountains and Niagara Falls. Apparently, he was the first Scandinavian who ever visited the falls, and of course he wrote a scientific paper about it. He even got it published on both sides of the Atlantic. Kalm finally returned to Sweden in May 1751. He brought with him not only his new family, but also bags and bags of various seeds that he hoped would grow and thrive in Sweden. But in the end, almost none of them took to Swedish soil. There would be no rice fields in the swamps of Finland. But at least he got a wife and a family out of the trip to North America. In addition, his descriptions of plants, animals, and human life on the other side of the Atlantic were widely read, not least since they were the first ones written in Swedish by a scientist. Back home in Sweden, Kalm actually became a disciple of yet another famous Swedish scientist, namely Anders Celsius. And that's actually a convenient segue, since Celsius is the next person I was planning to talk about. It's almost as if I'd planned it. Anders Celsius was a physicist, and most of us mention his name on a daily basis. And that's pretty rare for someone who's been dead for almost 300 years. The reason for that, of course, is that he invented the centigrade temperature scale, and today temperatures are measured in Celsius in the whole world, with the exception of a few Pacific Island nations and the US. He was born in Uppsala, the son of an astronomer and the daughter of the professor of astronomy at the university there. Eventually, Anders Celsius would take over his grandfather's position, becoming professor of astronomy at Uppsala University. Celsius's paternal grandfather was also a successful astronomer and mathematician, whereas his uncle, Olof Celsius, was a renowned linguist, so he was clearly the black sheep of the family. As professor of astronomy, Anders Celsius wanted to improve the facilities to observe space, because there was no suitable place for that in Uppsala at the time. So in 1732, 2 years after becoming professor, Celsius set out on a 5-year European tour to study various observatories. Classic professor behavior right there. As soon as you get tenure, you stop working and just go on a half-a-decade-long sabbatical, calling it research. Well, maybe I'm a little unfair, at least to Anders, because he did quite a lot of work on his European tour. While in Nuremberg, in Bavaria, he published papers on the Northern Lights, and they became quite the sensation, even though he gave them the not exactly enticing title observationes de lumine boreali ab anno millesimo septigentesimo sexto decimo ad annum millesium septingentesimum vicesimum secundum partim a se partim ab alis in Suecia habitas. Rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Later, when visiting the Papal States, the Pope himself allowed Celsius to make observations from the Grand Gallery at Monte Cavallo, and there, among other things, the Swedish astronomer discovered that the sun shines 320,000 times brighter than the moon, and that it's 100 times brighter at midday than at dawn or dusk. In Paris, Celsius got involved in a heated scholarly debate about the shape of the Earth. Some French scientists believed that Newton was correct and that the Earth was slightly flattened at the poles. Others insisted that it was the other way around and that the Earth was actually pointier at the poles, like an egg or a lemon. Astronomical measures made in France couldn't settle the argument. They needed to make measurements in two places, one closer to the equator and one closer to the poles. The French Academy of Sciences sent off an expedition to modern-day Ecuador to make measurements there, and Anders Celsius suggested that a second expedition go to Lapland. He even volunteered to participate in it. They set off from Paris in 1736. If Linnaeus had faced hardships in terms of no roads, living for months in the wilderness and fighting with the mosquitoes, that was nothing compared to the logistical complications that Celsius and his French companions had to deal with. They had to schlep heavy, sensitive, and expensive instruments through forests and across swamps to reach mountain peaks where they'd be able to make their observations. These peaks were also covered in forest, so a detachment of Finnish soldiers were sent to cut down the trees on no fewer than 8 mountain peaks to give the astronomers free sightlines. All the hard work, drudging through the forests and swamps, not to mention the cutting down of all those trees, paid off though. The two expeditions could eventually return to Paris in triumph and prove that the egg/lemon theory was wrong. Newton had been right all along, and the Earth was indeed a little flatter at the poles. Eventually, Celsius returned to Uppsala, where he raised money to build Sweden's first astronomical observatory. It was ready in 1741, the same year the Hat government started their ill-fated war of revenge against Russia. Beside his astronomical achievements, Anders Celsius also contributed to the debate that led to Sweden finally abandoning the Julian calendar and joining the rest of Europe using the Gregorian calendar, even though it was invented by a Catholic. So in 1753, the last 11 days of February were dropped, and Wednesday, February 17th, was followed by Thursday, March the 1st. Even though the change made a lot of sense, there was still opposition to the move, not least because some people feared their lives would now be 11 days shorter than it should have been. Another achievement on Celsius's long list of achievements was the discovery that the sea level along Sweden's coastline was receding. This is happening because of the so-called tectonic uplift following the latest ice age. But since Celsius didn't have a clue about anything tectonic, or the fact that there had even been an ice age, he assumed that the sea was slowly evaporating. At the time, this actually became a source of some concern among climate-conscious people in the educated classes. But, as I already mentioned, the thing Anders Celsius is still best remembered for is his division of the thermometer into 100 degrees based on the temperature when water freezes and boils. Before Celsius, various random systems had been introduced. One of those, introduced by a German physicist called Fahrenheit, is still used today in a few countries. Celsius actually introduced his division of the thermometer late in life, only 2 years before his untimely death in tuberculosis at the age of 42 in 1744. And originally, he wanted 100 degrees to be the freezing point and 0 to indicate boiling. But after his death, the scale was turned upside down and the format we know and love today was established. The third and last person I'd like to talk about today is the physicist Jonas Ahlström. He's actually better known as an industrialist because he took advantage of the economic policies during the Age of Liberty, and at least in his case, Sweden benefited as well. Like Linnaeus, he was also ennobled. A part of the new policy of ennobling people who did things that benefited society, not only those who killed foreigners on various battlefields on the continent. After he received his noble title, he changed his name from Ahlström to the far posher Alströmer, and it's under that name that he's known to history. He was one of the 6 who established the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, but he's best known for his great interest in agriculture. As I've alluded to earlier, Swedish authorities were looking for ways to secure the country's food supply. That's why one of Linnaeus' disciples had been looking into growing American wild rice in Finland. But it was Alströmer who solved the problem by popularizing the cultivation of potatoes in Sweden. But unlike what the popular food-related factoid would have you believe, and Alströmer himself actually claimed, he did not introduce the potato to Sweden. Even though this new vegetable was initially met with skepticism from many Swedish peasants, it eventually eradicated starvation in the country, not least thanks to its sturdiness. It can grow far north, where you can't rely on wheat cultivation, thereby providing a reliable source of food for an untold number of poor Swedes and Finns. Jonas Alströmer had actually been one of these poor people. His parents didn't have much money, so Jonas had to leave home early to get a job. In 1707, he tagged along when a friend of his went to London to open a business there. 3 years later, Alströmer took over that business and managed it very successfully. He was so successful, in fact, that in 1709, the same year the Swedish army was annihilated at Poltava, he became a burgher in London and a naturalized Englishman. While he was in England, Alströmer was amazed by the industrial development there and struck by how backwards and primitive Sweden was in comparison. He decided that he wanted to do what he could to jumpstart the Swedish industrial development, and after the death of Karl XII and the introduction of the Age of Liberty, he saw his opportunity to do so. In 1723, Alströmer returned to Sweden and went about opening his first textile factories. Since there was no one in Sweden who had the appropriate knowledge or experience, he had to start by hiring workers in France and the Netherlands. He also had to import all the machinery from there, and this turned out to be trickier than hiring people. You see, it was illegal to export machinery, tools, or raw materials from the Netherlands, and local Dutch authorities and factory owners did what they could to stop him. But in the end, he succeeded and could import what he needed both from the Netherlands and from England. Alströmer opened his textile factory in Alingsås, the town where he'd grown up, and King Frederick himself became a partner in the business. After a royal inspection, the king was so impressed with what he saw that he ordered enough fabric to make uniforms for all the servants at the royal palace in Stockholm. Alströmer's business empire eventually formed the basis for the Swedish textile industry. The master tradesmen he had hired abroad taught Swedish workers how to do the job, and that way the knowledge spread throughout the country. The growth of the textile industry was nothing short of explosive. By 1754, no fewer than 14,000 people worked in textile production, and 7 years later, that number had risen to 18,000. This not only made Jonas Alströmer rich, it was also a significant contribution to the crown's tax revenues. During his long life as an industrialist, he opened a large number of factories and other businesses. He grew tobacco, he founded sugar refineries, and started large-scale sheep farming, to name but a few. Far from all of them turned out to be profitable, but he got the Industrial Revolution off to a great start in Sweden, and his successes far outweighed the failures, at least in monetary terms. Alströmer was personally largely to thank for the fact that Sweden's trade balance shifted from a significant deficit to a surplus of $4 million annually. On balance, I'd say he deserved his ennoblement, as did Carl Linnaeus. Celsius probably would have received a knighthood as well if he hadn't died so young. Anyway, we've reached the end of this whirlwind tour of scientific developments during the Age of Liberty. Next time, we'll dive right back into the grubby world of politics with a look behind the scenes at Christiansborg Palace in Copenhagen. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. If you crave more content related to Scandinavian history, I recommend you look up the show on social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. And if you've abandoned it in favor of Blue Sky, you can find me there as well. I look forward to hearing from you.